Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 96 from the land where the sun rises. Once again, we are still talking about the reign of Kashikiya Hime from the late 6th to early 7th century. This time, though, we're going to take a quick diversion from Yamato and first look at what was going on over on the continent in the area of the Yellow and Yangtze River basins, the area of the so called Middle Country. This is, after all, where a lot of the philosophy and other things that the archipelago was importing came from. So, what exactly was going on over there? Back in episode 73, we talked about the various northern and southern dynasties in the Yellow and Yangtze River basins. To sum up, during that period, the eastern area of modern China was split between a variety of dynasties, many of them short lived, and many of them, especially in the north, were dynasties from outside of the main Han ethnic group. Through the early 580s, the dynasty in charge of the Yellow River region was the Northern Zhou, one of the many dynasties in the north descended from the nomadic Shanbei ethnic groups. Though their aristocracy was a mix of multiple ethnicities that had intermarried over the years, the Northern Zhou celebrated their Shanbei roots, often to the detriment of ethnic Han groups. They had inherited the territory of the Western Wei, including much of the central Yangtze River down to Sichuan. They then defeated the Northern Qi in 577 and claimed dominion over all of the Yellow River region in the north of modern China. Their only rival was the Chen dynasty along the eastern reaches of the Yangtze River, but the Chen themselves were relatively weak, and it was only the power struggles within the Northern Zhou court that kept them from wiping out the Chen completely. In 581, the Northern Zhou suffered a coup d'etat. Yang Jian was a northern Zhou general, and his family, the Yang clan, had Han origins, but had intermarried into the Shanbei as well, creating a truly mixed lineage. Jian also held some sway at court and was known as the Duke of Sui. His daughter was the Empress Dowager, and her stepson was the young Emperor Jing. In 581, Yang Jian usurped power from his step grandson, the child Emperor Jing, and placed himself on the throne, taking the name Emperor Wen of Sui, using his previous title as the name of the new dynasty. Now, he killed off 59 princes of the previous Northern Zhou royalty and began to consolidate his power. By 587, he had strengthened his position, and by 588, invasion of the Chen territories began under Prince Yangguang. By 589, the Chen were defeated, and any attempts at rebellion were put down, giving the Sui dynasty full control of northern and southern regions, from the Yellow and Yangtze rivers down to the Sichuan basin. Although, as I noted, the Yang family had intermarried with the Shanbei families of the northern Zhou, they still retained some connection with their Han roots, and Emperor Wen won over the Han Confucian scholars with reforms to the rank system and at least a nod towards getting rid of nepotism and corruption, which had taken hold in the northern Zhou and many of the previous dynasties. He reinstituted Han dynasty titles and restored the nine-rank system. He also reinstituted a system of impartial judges to seek out talent and move towards the idea of an examination system, something that would really take hold in later centuries. Furthermore, while he set himself up in the northern capital of Daxingchang, aka Chang'an, he helped rebuild the southern capital, naming it Dayang. He also supported Buddhism and Taoism. He became a patron of southern Buddhist monasteries and recognized major temples as state sponsored institutions, a far cry from the suppression attempts in the north in 574 and 578. Emperor Wen also worked on repairing canals along the Yellow River. These canals, which allowed easy transport of goods, regularly silted up if they didn't have good maintenance, and the dikes on either side could break, flooding the land. They had been neglected during many of the short lived reigns up to this point, with perhaps a few exceptions well, when the dikes got really bad. However, Emperor Wen began work to fix these old canals and thus improve the flow of goods and services, not to mention keeping it from flooding everyone. Given all of this, his patronage of Buddhism and Taoism, as well as his attempt to resurrect the Han dynasty and the Confucian principles that underlay its government, and the public works that he instituted, Yang Jian, aka Emperor Wen of Sui, is remembered as the cultured emperor, despite the fact that he had started out as a blood soaked general who had secured his usurpation with a not inconsiderable amount of murder. Sima Guang, writing from the Song dynasty, centuries later, praised Emperor Wen for all he did to grow the Sui, uniting North and South, supporting the people, and helping the country to prosper as it rarely had before. And yet, Sima Guang also says that in his personal life, he was mean and stingy and paranoid, afraid that everyone was out to get him. Given the life that he'd lived, that would make some sense. I mean, he'd cooed the previous dynasty, so he sure as hell probably thought that someone was going to coup him. Still, he seems to have been good for his people in the long run. But this wasn't to last. In 604, Emperor Wen fell ill and died. Or at least, that's the official story. Another says that he had grown angry over some event and was about to disinherit the crown prince, Yang Guang, who sent someone to kill his father. That's a very abbreviated version of the story, and as I said, it's not without controversy. However, he died, his son, Yang Guang, succeeded him to the throne and became known as Emperor Yang. Emperor Yang continued to expand the empire, and under his dynasty, the Sui would attain their greatest extent yet. He rebuilt parts of the Great Wall and expanded the borders south into modern Vietnam, as well as up to the borders with Goguryeo. He also continued the work his father had begun on the canals, eventually undertaking the creation of the Grand Canal, which would connect the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. No longer would the two be separate, forced to send goods out to sea or over treacherous land routes to get from one river basin to the other. Now they could sail ships straight from one river to the other, an impressive feat that you can still see today in parts of modern China. The project would forever change the landscape of China both literally and figuratively. It connected the North and South, leading to greater political, economic, and cultural unity between the two regions. It would connect the culture and economic resources of the South with the military institutions of the North. Unfortunately, for all that this expansion may have been good for commerce, it came at a price. The wars in Champa and southern Vietnam saw thousands of Sui soldiers die from malaria. And then in the north, though they continuously pushed against Goguryeo, they were never quite able to overthrow them. Finally, there was the Grand Canal. Although it would truly be a wonder of the world and become part of the lifeblood of dynasties for centuries to come, it was built at a huge price, both monetarily and in human lives. We can assume a large number of people died as conscript labor working on the canals or on refurbishing the Great Wall, but also we're told that the monetary price largely bankrupted the empire. And that's something for which later historians would castigate the Sui dynasty. But all that was still to happen. For our purposes, we should rewind a bit to the very beginning of the 7th century. As we touched on last episode, Yamato was just adopting their own 12 rank system and a 17 article constitution shortly after Emperor Wen passed away and Yang Guang took the throne. Now, these 17 articles were almost all based on Confucian or Buddhist philosophy. Clearly, the court was looking to the continent more and more for inspiration on how to govern, especially as it further expanded and solidified its grasp across the archipelago. Up to this point, much of that innovation had come through the Korean peninsula by way of Shilla, Goguryeo, and most prominently, their ally Baekje. No doubt they knew that much of what was influencing those kingdoms had itself come from even farther away. And so this reign, the chronicles record that Yamato once again sent envoys beyond the peninsular neighbors all the way to the Middle Kingdom itself. This is significant as they were making direct contact with the mighty empire, the source of so many of the philosophical and scientific innovations that Yamato was trying to adopt. This wasn't the first time this had happened, of course. We know of cases of the state of Na contacting the Han court, and then Himiko of Wa during the Wei period, as well as several missions immediately after Himiko's death. We also know of the 5 kings of Wa who reached out to the Liusong court, though the chronicles themselves are often silent on any actual embassies, making it hard to tell exactly which reigns that occurred in, though it's generally agreed that one of those 5 kings was none other than Wakatakiru himself, Yu Ryakutenno. There may have been other missions. There seems to be some discussion amongst the Liang dynasty records that may indicate greater contact with Japan, but again, we don't necessarily see that in the records themselves. Furthermore, with the fractured nature of the various dynasties since the Han period and the various conflicts on the peninsula and in the archipelago, It would be understandable if there hadn't been much direct diplomatic contact since about the time of Wakatakiru. And so it's a pretty big thing that we not only have an envoy around the year 608, but that there appears to be agreement for it in the Sui history. Though there is one glaring mistake. In the Nihon Shoki, they clearly say that they sent envoys to the Great Tang. That's the dynasty following the Sui, not the Sui themselves. However, this is fairly easily explained. You see, by the 8th century, as the records were being compiled, the Tang dynasty was indeed in control of the Chinese court. In fact, the Tang dynasty was so admired by the Japanese that even now the term karafu, or Chinese style, uses the character of the Tang dynasty rather than that of the Han. On the one hand, it seems as though the scholars of the 8th century would surely have known of the Sui dynasty coming before the Tang, but it's also understandable that anyone would have just thought of the successive courts as a single continuity. Either way, I'll talk about the Sui dynasty, and it's in the Sui dynasty records that we find the corresponding description of this embassy. It starts on the third day of the seventh month of 607. The chronicles tell us that Ono no Omi no Imoko was sent to the Sui court, taking along Kuratsukuri no Fukuri as an interpreter. You may recall that the Kuratsukuri, or saddle makers, claimed a descent from Shiba Tato, himself from the continent. It would make sense to take someone on this diplomatic expedition who could actually speak the languages, or, failing that, at least read and write it. Peculiar function of the Chinese language, since the various dialects, though often mutually unintelligible, still use the same characters. Imoko, by the way, may have also had important connections, but in this case it was to the Soga. We're told in the Nihon Shoki that Imoko was known in the Sui court as So Imko, and the So character is the same as the first character in the name of Soga. It's possible that Imako was indeed a Soga family member, and the name Ono no Omi may have come later. Or it's possible that he was forgotten for some reason. On the Sui side, we're told that in the year 607 there was an envoy sent with tribute from King Tarashihiko, which may have been another name for Kashikiya Hime, or perhaps it was simply an error caused by the problems with attempting to record foreign names in Sinitic characters. The arrival of the embassy must have been something else, especially as they came upon the capital city. Wen's capital city, that of Da Xingchang, was a new city built just southeast of the ancient city of Chang'an, which was in a sad state of decay despite hosting so many rulers over the centuries, including the Northern Zhou themselves. Wen had laid out a new plan of a permanent rectangular city with the royal palace taking up the northern central district. Buddhist and Taoist temples were scattered throughout the city. The city itself was 5 to 6 miles on a side, and so it would take time to truly build it out. However, first the walls were set up, and then the palace area, so that Wen and his family effectively moved into an empty city when he arrived in 583. Many people were forcibly resettled, and members of the new royal family were encouraged to set up their own palaces, but it would really take time to truly fill up. By the end of the Sui dynasty and the beginning of the Tang, the city was still being built, and it wouldn't see its ultimate heyday as a vibrant urban capital until the Tang dynasty. And so, when the Yamato delegation arrived in 608, they would have seen the impressive walls and the immense palace, but in all likelihood, much of the city was still being built, and there was probably construction on every block. Nonetheless, the sheer size would have to have made an impression on them. Nothing like this existed in the archipelago, in the slightest. On the other hand, the Sui had their own curiosities about Yamato. History of the Sui, written only 20 to 30 years afterwards, starts out its account with a description of the land of Wa. Some of it is taken directly from the Wei histories, recounting what was previously known about these islands across the Eastern Sea. We talked about that back in episodes 11 to 13 if you want to go back and listen. Sui history summarizes these previous historical accounts, including mentions of envoys that came over during the Qi and Long dynasties between 479 and 556, though little more is actually said. Then the Sui history mentions an envoy that's said to have arrived in the early part of the Sui, the Kai Huang era, between 581 to 600. We're told that this was for a king whose family name was Ame and his personal name was Tarashihiko, with the title of Okimi, at least according to the transliterating that we're doing, as the characters used have slightly different pronunciations, but that seems the most likely. This could all easily be attributed to just mistranslations between the spoken Japanese and the written Chinese of the time. Now, even the family and personal names, they're familiar but not exactly attributed in the Chronicles, though we have seen the elements elsewhere in the royal family, and it may be that they were also titles of a sort. Also, they mention a king, but that could also just be due to the fact that Okimi was not a gendered title, and as such, the Sui simply assumed a male ruler. Regarding the ways of the court, there's no direct evidence of this in the Chronicles. However, it is said that at the time they looked into the ways of Wa and they were told that the king of Wa deems heaven to be his elder brother and the sun his younger. Before break of dawn, he attends the court and, sitting cross legged, listens to appeals. Just as soon as the sun rises, he ceases these duties, saying that he hands them over to his brother. This is likely a misunderstanding once again, but it rings with some truth. Even if we discard some of the legends about Amaterasu as later additions, there's plenty of linguistic and cultural evidence that the sun held a special place in Wa culture. There's also the article in the new constitution about starting early to work that might just be referenced here. We aren't sure exactly when the Sui collected this information, though given that it was written within living memory of many of the events, a lot of the information is considered to be at least plausible, if perhaps a bit misunderstood at times. Sui history specifically mentions the 12 court ranks. In fact, it's possible that the Chronicles, compiled in the 8th century, were actually referencing this earlier history about the ranks, though we know that ranks did continue in the archipelago in one way or another, so they had to start somewhere. It also makes the comment that there were no regulated numbers of officials in each rank. It would certainly be the case later that they would regulate the numbers, and that makes sense when the ranks also dictated how much of a salary one could expect from the court. Then, outside of the court, they mention the kuni, probably the kuni no miyatsuko, as a type of provincial governor. And they mentioned that each kuni no miyatsuko oversaw about 10 inaki, officials in charge of the royal granaries, who themselves each oversaw 80 families. It's doubtful that these numbers were that precise, but it gives you an interesting concept of scale. Sui history tells us about other things that the chronicles tend to leave out. We're told that the men wore both outer and inner garments with small, likely meaning narrow, sleeves. Their footgear was like sandals painted with lacquer, which sounds not unlike geta, which we do have evidence for going back into the Yayoi at least, though this was apparently only for the upper crust. Most people just went barefoot, wearing a wide piece of cloth tied on without any kind of sewing, so they say. We do get a hint at the headgear that was instituted, along with the court rank system. We're told that it was made of brocade and colored silk and decorated with gold and silver inlaid flowers, which does correspond to some of what we know from the Chronicles. As for the women of Yamato, we're told that they arrange their hair on the back of their head and that they wear outer garments and scarves with patterns. They have decorated combs made of bamboo as well. They also wore tattoos, as did the men. Much of this, including the tattoos, accords with what we have evidence of in the Haniwa from the 6th century and later. For sleeping arrangements, we're told that they weave grass into mattresses, possibly the origin of the later tatami, that would originally just be woven mats, but eventually turned into a type of permanent flooring. For covers, we're told that they use skins lined with colored leather. Curious blanket, and one wonders if this was for everyone or just the upper crust. We're given some discussion of their weapons and armor, including their use of lacquered leather and the fact that they made arrowheads out of bone. We also know they used metal arrowheads, but bone was likely the more prevalent material, as losing a metal arrowhead was much more costly than losing a bone one. Interestingly, we are told that though there is a standing army, wars are infrequent, which may have been accurate in relation to what the Sui themselves had gone through and seen, since it seems like they were almost constantly fighting somewhere along their borders. But Yamato was far from peaceful, and it's telling that the court was accompanied by music and displays of military might. As for the justice system, we talked about this a little in previous episodes based on various punishments we've seen in the archipelago. The Sui history gives us slightly more direct descriptions. It claims that there were some high crimes that were punished by death, others were punished by fines, often meant to make restitution to the aggrieved. If you couldn't pay, you'd be enslaved to pay for it instead. They also mention banishment and flogging. All of this is in line with some of what we've seen in the Chronicles, though it also seems like some of this may have depended on other factors, including the accused's social status. After all, not everyone had rice land that they could just turn over to wipe out their misdeeds. Then there were the various judicial ordeals. We've mentioned this idea, with the idea that somehow the righteous would be protected from injury. These included things like pulling pebbles out of boiling water or reaching into a pot to grab a snake and hoping he doesn't bite you. There are also various tortures designed to get one to confess. In discussing literacy, the Sui historians mention that the Wa have no written characters, and at this point the writing would have been some form of Sinic characters, assuming one could read and write at all. Instead, the Sui anthropologists said that the Wa used notched sticks and knotted ropes as a means of conveying messages. How exactly that worked, I'm not sure, but there are certainly cultures that we know use things like knotted rope for various math and conveying numbers, etc. In regards to religion, the Sui noted that Buddhism had taken hold, but it had not gotten rid of other practices. Thus, we know that they practiced forms of divination and had faith in both male and female shamans. In their free time, people would enjoy themselves. On New Year's Day, they would have archery tournaments, play games, and drink. The Sui said that it was very much like how they themselves celebrated. Cormorant fishing and abalone diving, well, diving for fish at least, are both noted already. Again, these are activities that continue into the modern day. At dinner, we're told that the people do not eat off of dishes or plates, but instead use oak leaves. We've actually seen mention of this kind of practice, and that may have just been a particular ritual or ceremony that made its way back. Finally, there are the rituals for the dead. We're told that people wear white, and white is often considered the color of death in Japan even today. They would have singing and dancing near the corpse, and a nobleman might lay in state, in a mogari shelter or temporary interment, for up to 3 years. Certainly, we've sometimes seen it take a while, especially if the kofun isn't ready to receive the body yet. Commoners apparently would place the body in a boat, and that was pulled along the shore or placed in a small palanquin, though what happens after that is something of a mystery. Sui envoys writing about this also apparently experienced an active period of Mount Aso, or another mountain so named, as they said it was belching forth fire from the rocks. As we've mentioned, the archipelago is particularly volcanically active, so I'm not surprised that an envoy might have had a chance to get to know a little bit more about that firsthand. Having thus described the country, the Sui Chronicles go on to describe the embassy that came over in the year 607. According to the history as translated by Tsunoda Ryusaku and L. Carrington Goodrich, the envoy from Yamato explained the situation as such. The king has heard that to the west of the ocean, a bodhisattva of the sovereign reveres and promotes Buddhism. Accompanying the embassy are several tens of monks who have come to study Buddhism. This is great as we see some of the things that the Japanese scholars left out, that there were Buddhists on this mission. For many, getting to the monasteries and temples of the Middle Kingdom was almost as good as making the trip all the way to India. Overall, the embassy appears to have been largely successful in their mission. The ambassador, Imoko, came back with an envoy from the Sui, Pei Shiqing, along with 12 other individuals. It's thought that this may have been the same embassy that then reported back to the court all the various details that the later Sui history captured. According to the Sui Dynasty history, the embassy first headed to Baekje, reaching the island of Chiku, and then, after seeing Taru in the south, they passed Tsushima and sailed out into the deep ocean, eventually landing on the island of Iki. From there, they made it to Tsukushi and on to Seoul. They then passed through some 10 countries until they came to the shore. Now, Naniwa no Kishi no Onari had been sent to bring them to court, and they had a new official residence erected for them in Naniwa. that is, modern Osaka. When they arrived on the 15th day of the 6th month of the year 608, Yamato sent out 30 heavily decorated boats to meet them, and no doubt make an impression. They met them at Yeguchi, the mouth of the river, and they were then ensconced in the newly built official residence. Official entertainers were appointed for the ambassadors. Nakatomi no Miyatoko no Muraji no Torimaru, O Hoshi no Kawachi no Atai no Nukade, and Fume no Fumibito no Oe. Meanwhile, Imoko continued on to the court proper to report on his mission. Unfortunately, for all the goodness that came from the whole thing, the trip had not been completely flawless. Sui Court had entrusted Imoko with a letter to pass on to the Yamato court, but the return trip through Baekje proved problematic to say the least. We're told that the men of Baekje stopped the party, searched them, and confiscated the letter. It's unclear whether these were Baekje officials or just some bandits, but the important thing was that Imoko had lost the message, which was a pretty grave offense. The minister suggested that despite all of his success, Imoko should be banished for losing the letter. After all, it was the duty of an envoy to protect the messages between the courts at all costs. In the end, it was agreed that yes, Imoko should be punished, but that might be a bad look in front of their guests. After all, he just represented them to the Sui court, and so Kashikiya Hime pardoned Imoko of any wrongdoing. A couple months later, on the 3rd day of the 8th month, preparations had been made and the envoys formally approached the palace. There they were met on the Tsubaki no Ichi road by 75 well-dressed horses. The Sui history says it was 200. And there Nukara no Muraji no Hirafu welcomed them all with a speech. After finally reaching the location of the palace, it was 9 more days before the Sui envoys were formally summoned to present themselves and state their reason for coming. Abe no Tori no Omi and Mononobe no Yosame no Muraji no Iraku acted as introducers for the guests, announcing who they were to the court. Then Pei Shi-ching had the various diplomatic gifts arranged in the courtyard and then presented his credentials to the court. Then, bowing twice, he gave his own account of why he had been sent. He announced greetings from the Sui emperor, recognized the work of Imoko, and then provided an excuse that the emperor himself could not make it due to his poor health. That last bit, I suspect, was a polite fiction, or perhaps an erroneous addition by the chroniclers. After all, it isn't like the Sui emperors were in the habit of just gallivanting off to an unknown foreign land, especially one across the sea. After delivering some polite niceties, Shi-ching also provided a detailed list of all the diplomatic gifts that they had brought. The dance that happened next is telling. In order to convey Pei Shi-ching's letter to the sovereign, it wasn't like they could just hand it. There were several levels of protocol and procedure that had to be observed. And so Abe no Omi took the letter up, handed it to Otomo no Kurafu no Muraji, who in turn placed it on a table in front of the great gate, where Kashikiya Hime could then get it. This setup is similar to the later court, where only certain individuals of rank were allowed up in the buildings themselves, whereas others were restricted to the ground. It's worth noting here that this is probably why there's such an emphasis on there being a king, because the envoys may never have actually seen Kashikiya Hime, with so many intermediaries between them and her. They may not have recognized that she was a woman at all. After that formal introduction, there was a month or more of parties for the envoys, until finally they had to return to the Sui court. When they departed, they were sent with 8 students and, once again, Imoko, who was bringing yet another letter back to the Sui court. The students were all scheduled to study various disciplines and bring the knowledge back to Yamato. That wasn't quite so special, or at least we aren't given much more on the specifics of what the students brought back. What really stands out in the Sui histories is the contents of the formal letter that Imoko was carrying, as it had a phrase that will be familiar to many students of this period of history, and which really connects across the Japanese and Sui histories. It read, "The Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises addresses a letter to the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets. We hope you are in good health." Or at least that's how the Sui histories record it. In the Nihon Shoki, they say something similar. "The Emperor of the East respectfully addresses the Emperor of the West. Here, rather than using child of heaven, the author made use of the term Tenno when referring to the Yamato sovereign, and then different characters were used for the Sui emperor. At the same time, that is one of the reasons that I give more credence to the Sui history. Of course, however you slice and dice this thing, there are some major errors being taken by the Yamato sovereign. Thus, it's no wonder that when the Sui emperor heard this, he was displeased to say the least. And he told his minister that the letter was discourteous and should never again be brought to his attention. So that's a whole mood. The reason for this offense, probably obvious, as the letter paints the sovereign of Japan as equal to the emperor of the Sui dynasty. That was indeed a bold claim. As we mentioned toward the top of the episode, the Sui were just about at their zenith. They defeated their enemies, taking control of both the northern and southern regions, expanded to their south and north, and they were using their vast reserves on massive public works. They were a large, established, and still growing empire. Comparatively, Yamato had what? 10,000, 100,000 households? No writing system? They were eating off of oak leaves, and yet they were taking on heirs and claiming that they were equal to the Sui. That had to garner more than a few eye rolls, and I really wonder at the temerity of the officer who presented it up the chain, especially as they would have seen what the Sui was really like, a reality that most envoys to the Sui court would have known firsthand. There's also the fact that they claim to be the land where the sun rises, while the Sui are the land where the sun sets, which may have just been referencing East and West in a poetic fashion, but on another level, it's almost as if they were talking about the rise of Yamato and the fall or setting of the Sui. I would note that we still don't see the term land of the rising sun or Nihon used for the name of the country yet. One of the reasons I continue to refer to Yamato and not just Japan. However, all of this is in keeping with the traditions of the Wa people as we know them. The sun was given a special place in their worldview, as demonstrated linguistically, and not just through the legends curated in the 8th century. By the way, this exchange is mentioned in both the Sui history and the Nihon Shoki, but they place it in slightly different contexts. According to the Sui histories, this was one of the first things that the envoys said, which might make sense since Yamato may not have exactly recognized the disparity between the Sui and themselves at that point, whereas in the version of the Nihon Shoki, it was actually sent with the second mission, where they fully knew who the Sui were. In either case, however, the content is relatively the same. Certainly, as Yamato continued to take on more and more of the trappings of the continental courts, they would eventually take on the term Tenno, also read in Japanese as Sumera no Mikoto, to refer to the sovereign. This is basically saying that the sovereign is indeed a heavenly son, and which they would come to translate as emperor in English. There would be other terminology and trappings that would reinforce this concept, which placed the sovereign of Japan in a position that, at least locally, seemed to be much more prestigious. Imoko came back from this last diplomatic mission and was well beloved. Some later sources even suggest that he may have been promoted for his diplomatic efforts. Oddly, however, we don't really hear more, if anything, about Imoko, and he fades back into the past. And so that covers much of the story of what Yamato was borrowing from the Sui and others during this period. Next episode? Well, I'm honestly not sure what we'll be covering next, as there's just so much going on during the reign of Kashikiya Hime, but stick around and we'll find out together. Until next time, thank you for listening, and thank you for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast. We'll have this and some more discussion on various topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. That's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.